Hello. Welcome to the Patreon book series, where I will be reading several books throughout the year. I would like to do either a chapter or two every week of a nice summary of whatever book that you, the Patreon audience, decides. I really would like to set this up as a poll type of system. We are a true democracy over here on the Patreon, unlike our own government. But I'm going to start with a book that I've had for a long time that I've been meaning to read and get through. But the next book is going to be up to you. I'm going to put up a couple different subjects, and then from whatever subject gets the most votes, we'll break that down into whatever revolutionary book is in that category. And I'll put a little bit of animation in it. These will not be word for word readings of the book. I'm not doing an audio book, but I am doing a very nice summary on every chapter and, just giving a space for us to talk about it, show off some diagrams, and, hopefully give all you gardening nerds a bit more value than what I can on the YouTube channel. So for the first book of the series, we are going with one that is called Teeming with Microbes: The Organic Gardener's Guide to the Soil Food Web by Jeff Lorenfels and Wayne Lewis. All right, so chapter 1, what is the soil food web and why should gardeners care? This is a great introductory chapter, starting off by saying that good soil is full of life, not just worms, but centipedes, ants, and microscopic organisms like bacteria and fungi. Most of this life exists on the top 4 inches of the soil, but some microbes thrive even miles below the surface. The soil teeming with life is essential for healthy food growth, which I feel like, as a gardener, we all know. But this book really focuses on how much one change to an area can affect the full biodiversity, which is something that I, for sure, don't think about when I'm switching out my plants or adding a bit more pH because I'm trying some berries that aren't going to work out. The chapter continues to go on by saying, beneath the surface, an unseen world of bacteria, fungi, and nematodes exist. A teaspoon of good soil can contain billions of bacteria and thousands of protozoa and nematodes. Every organism in the ecosystem needs energy, with most relying on carbon from organic material. The soil food web is a system of interactions where organisms consumed and are consumed, forming a complex but essential chain. As you can see here, the food web that we were taught way back as children, it's always in play, and I think there's a bit of disconnection with at least my thought in the garden when I think about my plants within the food chain, because I have so much animal pressure that I complain about on the YouTube channel. And, I don't want my plant to be part of like the natural food chain. I'm growing it for myself. I don't want any of the rodents going into my chain and breaking me off from it. Yet this book is going to go through how even just like proper planting is part of this kind of unseen food chain that's underneath the soil that, of course, I certainly have not thought about until opening this book. So the next section goes on to say that your plants are in control. Most gardeners believe plants simply absorb nutrients, but they actively shape their environment by secreting chemicals through the roots, known as exudates. Exudates? Let's see.
Exudates.
All right, so let's go back through that. Most gardeners believe plants simply absorb nutrients, but they actively shape their environments by secreting chemicals through their plants, known as exudates. These exudates attract beneficial microbes, including bacteria and fungi, that help the plant access nutrients. The rhizosphere, the area around the roots, is a hotspot for this microbial activity. Bacteria and fungi feed on these exudates, attracting larger organisms like nematodes and protozoa. This cycle results in the release of the plant-available nutrients directly at the roots. So what I'm getting from this is a very healthy root system can essentially attract its own food. At the core of the soil food web are plants, which control microbial populations to suit their needs. Research suggests that plants can influence the types of fungi and bacteria that thrive in their rhizosphere, shaping their own nutrient intake. What this is stating is that a healthy root system can attract its own food, essentially, and it's wild to think about the root systems that I've had to pull up in my own yard, where they just like weren't developed, but a few spaces over, the same plant, same planting techniques, planting days, same watering, has a very healthy, like robust system. And my thought just kind of going through this is like, the beginning of your root system's life seems to be the most crucial, because once it starts becoming a healthy root system, it attracts more and more of its own nutrients that it needs. So if it starts out bad, it never attracts more of the nutrients that it will eventually need. Chapter goes on to say that plants influence microbial populations by producing exudates that vary throughout the growing season. These exudates, this is such a weird word. These exudates attract beneficial bacteria and fungi, which retain nitrogen and other nutrients, acting as fertilizer bags. Protozoa and nematodes then come along, consume these microbes, and release their nutrient as waste. They basically poop all around the rhizosphere, making that available to the plants. This natural cycle has sustained plant life for millions of years, with plants driving the process of continuously producing exudates. Again, kind of coming back to the thought of the beginning of your plant's life is so crucial, because it will or will not attract, these microbes that will poop all in the rhizosphere. If you are coming out with unhealthy plants that have unhealthy root systems, microbes don't want to poop around your unhealthy plant. Microbes, they want to poop around the best of the best. That's what I'm getting from this. To continue on, soil life creates soil structure. Protozoa and nematodes are consumed by arthropods, which includes insects, spiders, and even shrimp-like creatures in the soil. These arthropods, in turn, become food for larger animals like birds and moles, forming the continuous food chain. As soil organisms move in search for food and shelter, they create pathways that improve aeration and water infiltration. Bacteria then produces sticky substances that help bind soil particles together, while fungal hyphae further stabilizes the soil by forming thread-like connections. This, of course, is referring to the great mycelial connection underground that our entire planet is probably covered by. I would certainly love to dive into a book about that. I have been interested in mushrooms, growing mushrooms for a very long time, and to speak about mushrooms in a gardening sense would be a dream. But we'll vote on that later. So continuing on, soil life produces soil nutrients. When organisms die, their nutrients are either passed to predators or decomposed by fungi and bacteria. These microbes help break down organic matter, releasing essential nutrients into the rhizosphere for plant absorption. Without this microbial activity, nutrients would just drain from the soil in a process in which they call leaching, which is something that home gardeners should be very wary of when we grow in grow bags or grow on top of a mound or on a slope like my yard is. I imagine that I experience tons of leaching every year that I definitely don't account for. Maybe this year I'll try to build up a lot of my beds so they're much more even, because I noticed at the end of the season, it does seem that my beds are just like struggling for organic material, which, I could do a better job of adding in the beginning of the season, of course, and just staying on top of, but also consider whether your plants are on a hillside, where the natural water flow would just leach tons of nutrients from your plants. The next section of the book goes on to state, healthy soil food webs actually control disease. A diverse soil food web prevents the overgrowth of harmful pathogens. A teaspoon of good soil contains up to 30,000 species of microbes, creating a balanced system where beneficial organisms outcompete harmful ones. If one species dominates too strongly, it can disrupt the balance, leading to disease and soil degradation. Fungal and bacterial networks also act as barriers against invading pathogens, protecting plant roots from infections. Now, I wonder how much of this can apply to things like potato rust and, some of those very vast diseases that, can destroy entire crops, or putting, big businesses in a lot of trouble. I wonder if because of, years and years and decades, honestly, of tilling the soil and adding tons of pesticides, I wonder if all of that is adding to, the breakout of these huge diseases. One can only imagine how messed up their soil food web actually is because of decades of tilling the soil and, all the stuff. So we continue to talk about some nitrogen. Not all nitrogen is the same. Nitrogen is one of the most critical elements in soil health. It becomes available to plants only after being processed by bacteria and fungi. In the 1980s, scientists discovered that the ratio of fungi to bacteria varies depending on the soil type. Natural growing forests typically have 10 times more fungi than bacteria, whereas distributed agricultural soils tend to have bacteria-dominated soil. This balance or imbalance influences plant growth, as different species prefer different microbial compositions. So this was, just backing up the thought of how different agricultural soil is compared to a natural soil. Decades and maybe a century, in some places of just tilling the soil makes that completely different than what's found in nature, just because of the things that don't die around the roots. The things that don't poop around agricultural roots are scientifically different than what we as home gardeners should be aiming for. Understanding nitrogen in the soil food web. Different plants thrive in different soil conditions. Perennials, trees, and shrubs prefer fungally dominated soils, whereas grasses and vegetables do better in bacteria-dominated soils. This distinction affects how nitrogen is processed in the soil. Nitrogen is released as an ammonium when microbes consume organic matter. In bacteria-dominated soils, this ammonium is converted into nitrate, while in fungally dominated soils, much of this nitrogen remains in ammonium form. Chemical fertilizers provide nitrogen mainly as nitrate, which benefits bacteria-dominated soils. All right, so let's take a step back and kind of break this down further. So in bacteria-dominated soils, like the ones found on big business agricultural land, this ammonium is converted into nitrate. But in our backyards, which should be more fungally dominated soils, this nitrogen remains in the ammonium form, right? So while the nitrate, which is normally on the agricultural dominated fields, benefits that soil, it's totally not good for us home gardeners. So what we are trying to avoid is that nitrogen becoming nitrate. So this is why we are filling our beds, our pots, our land, our little bit of land with tons of organic matter, because we don't want that nitrogen to be converted into nitrate. And by controlling this microbial balance, we actually encourage our plants to thrive more naturally without synthetic fertilizers. Because again, that nitrogen that is eaten by the microbes in our fungally dominated soil isn't converted into anything. It stays as nitrogen in its most natural form. So the book goes on to speak about the negative impacts on the soil food web. Chemical fertilizers, pesticides, fungicides disrupt this natural soil food web. They can be toxic to the essential microbes, thus reducing biodiversity and altering the nutrient cycle. So when plants rely on synthetic fertilizers, they actually bypass the natural microbial process that sustains good soil health. Once beneficial organisms like bacteria, fungi, and protozoa are lost, other soil organisms like earthworms also disappears. This leads to compacted soil, poor drainage, and an increase on the dependence of artificial inputs like synthetic fertilizers. Over time, soil health degrades, making gardening more labor intensive. So by utilizing things that we actually consider to be, more convenient, such as synthetic fertilizer, we've all seen them, the 1, 2, and 3 that will give your plant everything it needs, just with like a teaspoon of whatever chemicals in there. We actually over time are giving ourselves more work to do because our soil from that moment on actually starts to degrade. So for example, this will be my 4th summer here at the house. And if the first year I started to use a bunch of synthetic fertilizer, I probably would have had a much better crop yield that year. I had to do a lot of turning. There's a lot of work that needed to be done. My backyard was a grass mound. Actually, I don't think I've ever shown this picture. Bada bing. Look at this. This is the very beginning of everything. Just a grassy slope. So that first year was certainly rough with planting. I had a lot of drainage issues because I did actually have to turn the beds. But from that moment on, if I was using synthetic fertilizer, I would have been making everything so much harder for future litho, and I'm very happy that I decided to go the organic route, just kind of on my own morals, because not even knowing how bad these synthetic fertilizers were for the soil, my thought was I just don't want to put them in my body, especially if I have a choice. But understanding how good soil, the drainage, the nutrient, and all of that can simply come from avoiding synthetic fertilizer and building a healthy root system is a very important thing, I think, for all of us to really understand. And that is chapter 1, the very beginning of not the biggest book, but I can already tell a very, very thought-provoking book because, just reading through this, I'm thinking about the soil food web in my greenhouse, which actually isn't the most natural right now. I have to say I haven't done the best with composting, adding compost to that bed. Of course, all the original soil came from the forest around me, but we are coming up on, I don't know, it's 3rd or 4th planting. So I imagine all the initial nutrients have been sucked up, especially by the bitter melon and tomatoes that I had over this past summer. So I think this is a great time and opportunity to think about your own soil in your backyard and where you have been planting season after season. And also if you are, receiving snow, which I believe, zone 7 and below, including myself, if you haven't been receiving snow, I think thinking about the exposed soil and how the microbes underneath that soil are reacting, and how do you feel your soil is at the top of every spring, because I know mine here always feels very compacted. And of course, after loosening it up, it's always better. But this year, I'm certainly going to make a more concerted effort of adding more compost to every single bed, and actually doing a lot better job of my mid-season fertilizers to actually help against the late season diseases that are very common around my area. But I hope you enjoyed chapter 1. This is kind of the format that I'm going to be going through. I think, the rest of the chapters will be a bit more detailed, of course, but this was a very nice introduction into the book. I hope all you soil nerds are really into this, because this is going to be cool. Not only am I learning, but I feel like I'm helping you learn. And if that's not the case, please let me know. This will be a free video on the Patreon. Chapter 2 and going forward will be for the higher tier tier Patreon. I just really hope that I am providing good value for you, especially if you're deciding to support me in my garden. I appreciate it. I appreciate it so much. So until next time, I'll be here reading about gardening.